cool, eh? But let me read that out so you can hear what it sounds like. Qui-Gon Jinn bolegi dai bonko stuka ani. Darth Maul bola murishani Tatooine stuka ani bola biskasi bulba. Mauhonik. Anakin stuka Han Solo. Palpatine stuka Jar Jar Binksi muliara murishani bosnas. Ben Guadinaros. Qui-Gon Jinn hopa murishani Watto. Obi-Wan muliara tisi fortin. Anakin gisca Palpatine gisca Mesa Windu bola Coruscanta. Luke gisca murishani Beru. Stuka Ben Kenobi gisca Luke bola Mos Eisley muliara Chewbacca. Stuka Obi-Wan hopa bisca Darth Maul. Udimandel. Anakin hopa Padme bola Wermo Naboo. Now, you might have some questions like, what does it mean, and how does it work, and why have I done this? Let's start with the why. It all began with a little video by Agma Shua asking for people to send in entries for the Cursed Conlang Circus number 3. The competition defined cursed as 1. Disturbing, painful or uncanny, 2. High effort, and 3. Clever. Other than sounding like a description of my overachieving evil twin Leonard, what really got me was the optional theme of tell a story. I thought, what if the story is the Conlang? What I mean by this is this. What if there was a story that the two speakers knew so well that they could have a conversation just by referring to the events in the story? I felt that if a story was long enough, or if enough different stuff happens in it, then you could use it to express more or less anything. I hope. This idea was explored briefly in Star Trek The Next Generation, Season 5, Episode 2, entitled STARMOK. Any resemblance between that name and my Conlang STARMOK is entirely coincidental. Commander Data explains it well.
They seem to communicate through narrative imagery, a reference to the individuals and places which appear in their mytho-historical accounts.
Thanks, Data. So I thought, let the mytho-historical account for this language be Star Wars, specifically the movies of episodes 1 through 6. The rules of the language are this. Only individual people and places which are specifically named in the films 1 through 6 can be referred to. Things like Darth Vader and Kamino, but not things like Topoka City, the city on the planet Kamino, or these guys in the Mos Eisley Cantina, apparently called Hem Dazon and Arlyle Scoose, which are never named during the films and only in subsequent ancillary works. And obviously you can't refer to unnamed things like the Mos Eisley Cantina or Bothan Spies.
Many Bothans died to bring us this information.
There is a finite number of particles to indicate relations between named entities. First, two named entities can be related to each other in one of 4 ways. Character X with character Y, character X at place Y, X qualified by Y, and character X towards character Y, and this might refer to an action or simply an attitude. Secondly, once a relation between X and Y is established, we'll call this Z, it can be situated in the narrative more specifically with the following particles. The first time Z happens, the second time Z happens, another time Z happens, the penultimate time Z happens, the last time Z happens, before Z happens, and after Z happens. There are even neat little glossing abbreviations. With, at, qual, to, first, skund, other, pnult, last, befr, after. In terms of syntax and constituents, the minimum you need is a single named entity, like Darth Plagueis, Darth Plagueis, which on its own might mean something like wise or wisdom. We can then expand on it into a phrase like Palpatine hopa Darth Plagueis, Palpatine towards Darth Plagueis, which might mean something like foolish, given how Papa Palpi feels about his old master. We could also have Palpatine hopa Anakin stuka Darth Plagueis, Palpatine towards Anakin, qualified by Darth Plagueis, to mean something like temptation or a false promise. Word order is entity, particle, optional time specifier, entity. I hope that makes sense. If not, the rest of this is not going to be easy peasy lemon squeezy, but will in fact be, as we like to say in Britain, difficult, difficult, lemon difficult. But that's normal for a cursed conlang, isn't it?
I got a bad feeling about this.
So we've seen the structure of these narrative particles, or as I like to call them, narticles. But what sounds should they have? Well, in Star Wars, there is a lingua franca for the criminal underworld called Huttese. You hear it a few times when OGs like Greedo or Jabba the Hutt speak. And thankfully, there are folks more dedicated than me who have taken great pains to document this language, which is more or less a relex of English, but that doesn't matter for our purposes. I relied on the brilliant personal project of Wermo's Guide, link below, for a baseline dictionary, and took words from it for mine articles. With is jiska, from the word for keep, i.e. keep the company of. At is bola, from go, because once you go somewhere, that's where you're at. Qual is stuka, from looks like, because if X looks like Y, it means they share qualities. And tu is hopa, from the verb to help. The temporal articles were more difficult because Wermo's dictionary was sorely lacking in time-related words. So I returned to the source material, namely that this language Huttese is spoken by members of the criminal underworld. So for words like before and after, I used kipuna and mulyara, meaning shoot and money, respectively, because you have to shoot the bounty before you get paid. For the other temporal articles, there was a weird entry in Wermo's dictionary, biska, meaning last fool. But it has the word last in it, so now biska is the narticle for the last time something happens. And if first is the opposite of last, then what's the opposite of a fool? It's a highly competent person, or murishani, a bounty hunter. So then our temporal scale is now based on a scale of idiocy. Unfortunately, if you ain't first, you're last. So only murishani relates to competence, and the other words are just different shades of idiot. Thankfully, what little vocabulary there is in Huttese, there seem to be plenty of words for fool. So the scale in order is murishani, wermo, stupa, kuchu, and biska. Lastly, I made a phonological assessment of Wermo's dictionary. The author, Summer, does not use the International Phonetic Alphabet, and it seems the words are mostly pronounced according to how they would be in English. I tried, best as I could, to IPA-ify it, and determine what the sounds and phonotactics would be. This is because the named entities have to have their names fit into the phonotactics of Huttese. I won't linger on this like a sunset on Tatooine, but the phonology and phonotactics are as follows. Now that the groundwork has been laid, let's translate the start of that opening crawl. Side note, the Wermo's Guide dictionary has a word for Jedi, Jedi, and palace, bunko, so I used that for temple instead of calcing it directly from English as Jedi Temple. When Qui-Gon Jinn is at the Jedi Temple and speaks to the Jedi Council about Anakin, he is certain that Anakin is the chosen one, thus conveying the idea of certainty. Also, you'll notice the word Ani instead of Anakin to make sure we are referring to the character when he is a child. Darsmol bola murishani Tatooine, stuka, ani jiska bizga sibulba. Here we have two scenes qualifying each other to hone in on what they have in common. One is when Darth Maul first arrives on Tatooine and releases 3 probe droids to explore, and the other is the last time we see Anakin and Sebulba together, which is the 3rd lap of the Boonta Eve pod race. What do these scenes have in common? Lots, probably, but in this instance it's that there are 3 things. 3 droids, 3 laps. So these 2 scenes juxtaposed is a long-winded way to get to the relatively simple concept of 3 things. So the meaning of the whole sentence, Qui-Gon Jinn bola Jedi bunko stuka ani, Darth Maul bola murishane Tatooine, stuka ani jiska biska sibulba, means something like certainty about 3 things. Or as the original text from Twilight says, about 3 things I was absolutely positive. Now, let's look at the original Twilight extract in full. About 3 things I was absolutely positive. First, Edward was a vampire. Second, there was a part of him, and I don't know how potent that part might be, that thirsted for my blood. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. We've seen how the first sentence would be rendered into STARMOK. This is then followed by a 3-part list introduced with the words first, second, and third. Given the huge effort we had in coming up with a way to express the concept of 3, these words seemed like they would be a challenge. But no. You see, in Star Wars Episode 1 The Phantom Menace, during the Bota Eve pod race, the two-headed sports commentator names the racers, and during the race the first 3 to drop out are Mahonic, Ben Quaternaros, and Odie Mandel. So we'll just use those names for first, second, and third. Easy peasy, lemon lemon. But how to translate Edward? Short answer is you can't. As far as I can tell, there is no character named in the Star Wars films episodes 1 through 6 called Edward. But I realised, for the sake of what Bella is saying here in the story of Twilight, it doesn't really matter what Edward's name is. The character would be the same if his name were Fred or Agamemnon. What's important is what he's like as a character, as a person. So I translated, if we can call it translation at this point, it's more like vaguely gesturing towards a concept you're trying to get across and hoping context will do the rest. I translated Edward as Anakin Stuka Han Solo. You know, because Anakin's kind of moody and dangerous, but Han Solo has a roguish charm and heart of gold, and both characters are involved in romance. I think these qualities denote the sparkly vampire of Edward pretty well. Speaking of, how to translate vampire. Drinking blood seems obvious, but that's explicitly referenced in Bella's second thing she's absolutely positive about. So really, I think what Bella's trying to say here about Anakin Stuka Han Solo is that he's a monster. So I've conceptually gestured to the idea of monstrousness with the phrase Palpatine Stuka Jar Jar Binksi Mulira Murishani Bosnas. Let's face it, Palpatine is a man of many qualities, one of which is being monstrous. So we need to qualify it a bit with a scene that occurs after Jar Jar Binks speaks to Boss Nass for the first time. This is when the characters travel through the planet core of Naboo and encounter various oceanic horrors, i.e. monsters. So altogether we have Anakin Stuka Han Solo, Palpatine Stuka Jar Jar Binks Hi Mulira Murishani Bosnas. Anakin qualified by Han Solo, Palpatine qualified by the time after Jar Jar Binks is first with Boss Nass. And it's at this point I realise there's a grammar mistake here. After the word Jar Jar Binksi, we need an article, which in this case would probably just be Jiska. Phew! 2 sentences down, 2 sentences to go. At this point, I should mention that there is no pronominal reference at all here. Bella says the word I a few times, but in STARMOK, it would be pretty hard to refer to either yourself or the person you're speaking with unless you had assigned yourselves descriptors based on characters in the mytho-cultural narrative. Maybe a culture that speaks this language would make names which are impossible in the narrative, like Darth Bola Camino, or Lamasu Bola Endor. But in this particular instance, we can infer who's doing what, and this is a pretty common thing for human speakers of Earth languages. Just like a Japanese, for example. If we take the phrase Chiyo no mitai, it means want to drink blood. But situated in a conversation, you'd know whether it means I want to drink blood, or you want to drink blood, or anyone else wants to drink blood, based on the context. And let me tell you, context does a lot of heavy lifting in STARMOK. Back to the translation. There was a part of him. I've done this as Qui-Gon Jinn Hopamurishani Watto. When Qui-Gon Jinn first interacts with Watto, he's asking him for parts to fix the Queen's spaceship. Gosh, that's a sentence I never thought I'd say. So the concept behind this phrase might distill down to meaning just part or parts. I didn't know how potent that part might be. I've done as Obi-Wan Mulira TC-14, Anakin Jiska Palpatine Jiska Mesa Windu Bola Coruscanta. Again, looks like I've left out an article between Obi-Wan and TC-14. Should probably be Jiska again. This refers to the time when Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon are aboard the Trade Federation ship over Naboo, and Obi-Wan expresses uncertainty and anxiety. And before you say, who's TC-14? It's the droid that greets them when they arrive who happens to say its own name, which means it's an allowed part of the lexicon of STARMOK.
I'm TC-14 at your service.
Then we have Anakin with Palpatine and Mace Windu on Coruscant. Lots of things happen, but notably Palpatine talks about power and strength. So we get the idea of powerful from this phrase. And it could be made more specific if needed with another narticle and named person like Stuka Palpatine hopa Mace Windu. To make it explicit, it's when Palpatine is doing something to Mace Windu, but I didn't want the sentence to get too long. So, conceptually, we have parts, uncertainty, and power. And now on to that thirsted for my blood. This is Luke Jiska Murishani Beru, Stuka Ben Kenobi Jiska Luke Bolamos Aisli Mulira Chewbacca, Stuka Obi-Wan Hopa Biska Dar Small. There's a lot going on here, with phrases qualifying other phrases. The first is Luke Jiska Murishani Beru. We see Luke taking a drink of some blue milk, so this gets across the idea of drinking, or thirst. Then there's Ben Kenobi Jiska Luke Bolamos Aisli Mulira Chewbacca. Here you'll notice the use of Ben Kenobi instead of Obi-Wan, because it specifically refers to him when he's old. I've also forgotten another Jiska. Maybe it's time for a retcon, and say that Mulira and Kipuna can be temporal or relational articles. The scene here is immediately after Ben Kenobi starts speaking to Chewbacca at the bar of the Mos Eisley Cantina, and Luke is attacked by two unnamed characters, and Ben Kenobi cuts one of their arms off. This is one of the only instances in Star Wars where there is any blood on screen, so the intended meaning is blood. However, lots of other things are happening in this scene, which is why it also has to be further qualified by another scene. Obi-Wan Hopa Biska Darth Maul, which is the last thing Obi-Wan does to Darth Maul, namely, cut him in half, during which we see a light spray of blood. So altogether, the words Luke Jiska Murishani Beru Stuka Ben Kenobi Jiska Luke Bola Mos Eisley Mulira Chewbacca Stuka Obi-Wan Hopa Biska Darth Maul get across the concept of drinking and blood. Add that to the rest, and we have Ben Guadinaros, Qui-Gon Jinn Hopa Murishani Wato, Obi-Wan Mulira TC-14, Anakin Jiska Palpatine Jiska Mesa Windu Bola Coruscanta, Luke Jiska Murishani Beru Stuka Ben Kenobi Jiska Luke Bola Mos Eisley Mulira Chewbacca Stuka Obi-Wan Hopa Biska Darth Maul, which concept by concept denotes second thing, part, uncertain, power, thirst, and blood. Then the last sentence. And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. I rendered it quite simply as Anakin Hopa Padme Bola Wermo Naboo. Anakin's feelings towards Padme the second time they are on Naboo. The first time they're on Naboo, Anakin's about 10 years old, and it's only when they are there for the second time that Anakin confesses his love for Padme, and his love runs deep. Thus, while some concepts in STARMOK to express things like the number 3 require the juxtaposition of two scenes, a concept like unconditionally and irrevocably in love can be done quite simply, because that feeling occurs in the mytho-cultural narrative of Star Wars episodes 1 through 6. And I guess that's it. I suppose I could talk about the orthography of the language, which can be conveyed in the romanized form I've used here, preferably as an opening crawl with appropriate backing track, or via stills or clips from the movies, but I don't have time to get into that. So there it is. That's my entry for the cursed Conlang Circus number 3, STARMOK, the language based on using the narrative of Star Wars episodes 1 through 6. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll leave you with little STARMOK text to translate yourselves.
And as always,